What would you do if you came home after a grueling day at work only to find your driveway blocked by a shiny BMW with a Karen Ho vanity plate? Most people would leave a note, call a tow truck, or maybe even confront the owner. But when the vehicle belongs to the most feared member of your homeowners association, someone who's made it her mission to make your life miserable, conventional solutions just won't cut it. That's when you need to get creative. And trust me, what happened next changed everything. Our community looks picture perfect from the outside. Manicured lawns, coordinated house colors, and not a basketball hoop or misplaced garden gnome in sight. That's because Whispering Pines Estates isn't just any suburban neighborhood. It's governed by one of the strictest homeowners associations in the county. Every mailbox must be the exact same height. Holiday decorations can only remain up for precisely 14 days, and God forbid you leave your trash can visible from the street after 7 p.m. on collection day. I never wanted to live in a place with so many rules. As a software engineer who spends most days solving complex problems, the last thing I need is someone policing the height of my grass or the shade of my window treatments. But the housing market was brutal, and Whispering Pines had the right combination of good schools, reasonable commute time, and, ironically, peace and quiet. At least, that's what the realtor promised. What she conveniently failed to mention was Karen Winters, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board. In her mid-50s, with an immaculate blonde bob that never moved, even in strong winds, Karen had been president of the board for 6 consecutive years. Nobody ran against her anymore. They were too afraid of finding themselves on her bad side. Good fences make good neighbors, my father used to say. In Whispering Pines, good neighbors follow Karen's interpretation of the HOA bylaws to the letter, or they suffer the consequences. The Millers learned this the hard way when they installed a small vegetable garden in their backyard without submitting the proper paperwork. Their zucchini plants were barely 6 inches tall when they received a $200 fine and a cease and desist letter. The Patels made the mistake of painting their front door a shade of blue that was Mediterranean azure instead of the approved Atlantic breeze. Their door was repainted at their expense within 48 hours. As for me, I tried to fly under the radar. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn within regulation height, and never left my trash can out past Tuesday evening. Still, Karen found ways to single me out. First, it was a warning about the excessive brightness of my porch light. Then a note taped to my mailbox about a package that had remained on my doorstep for an unsightly period, less than 5 hours, while I was at work. But nothing compared to what happened 3 months after I moved in. I'd installed a small security camera above my garage. Nothing fancy, just a basic model to keep an eye on my property while I was away. The camera was barely visible tucked beneath the eaves. 2 days later, I received an official HOA violation notice claiming the camera was an invasion of community privacy and aesthetically inconsistent with neighborhood standards. When I pointed out that the HOA bylaws had no specific regulations about security cameras, Karen's thin smile never wavered. The board has broad authority to maintain community standards, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We're voting on new security guidelines at next month's meeting. Until then, the camera needs to come down. I removed the camera, fuming but unwilling to make waves so early in my residency. In retrospect, I should have fought harder. That capitulation only emboldened her. The real trouble began on a rainy Thursday evening. I was returning from a particularly difficult day at work. A major client had threatened to pull their contract, our servers had crashed, and my boss had made it clear that both problems were somehow my responsibility to fix. All I wanted was to park in my garage, pour myself a drink, and decompress. Instead, I found Karen's BMW parked directly across my driveway, blocking access completely. I sat in my car for a moment, rain pattering on the roof, wondering if this was some kind of mistake. Had she not realized she was blocking me? I checked the neighboring houses and noticed several cars parked in the cul-de-sac across the street. There was clearly an HOA meeting happening at the Johnson's house. I got out of my car, rain immediately soaking through my shirt, and walked over to the Johnsons' front door. I rang the bell, trying to control my irritation. After a moment, Karen herself answered, wineglass in hand. "Yes," she said, eyebrows raised as if I were a door-to-door salesman interrupting her dinner. "Your car is blocking my driveway," I said, gesturing toward her BMW. "I can't get into my garage." Karen glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. "Oh, we're in the middle of an important budget meeting. I'll move it when we're done. Shouldn't be more than an hour or so." She began to close the door. "Wait," I said, putting my hand out. "It's pouring rain and I need to get into my garage now. There's plenty of legitimate parking spots available." I pointed to the cul-de-sac. Karen's smile tightened. "Those spots are for official HOA business only during meetings. It's in the bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 3. You might want to familiarize yourself with the rules, Mr. Mitchell." She paused, looking me up and down. "Your landscaping could use some attention, by the way. Those hydrangeas along your fence are nearly 2 inches taller than regulation height." Before I could respond, she closed the door firmly in my face. I stood there, rain dripping from my hair, completely dumbfounded. Had she seriously just refused to move her illegally parked car while simultaneously threatening me about my hydrangeas? I walked back to my car, anger building with each step. I considered calling a tow truck, but I knew that would only escalate things. Karen would make it her personal mission to find every possible violation on my property. So instead, I backed my car into the street, parked at the curb, technically allowed for up to 3 hours, according to those same bylaws she loved to quote, and trudged through the rain to my front door. That night, I pored over the HOA documentation, searching for something, anything, that might give me leverage. The bylaws were comprehensive, covering everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the specific breeds of trees permitted in front yards. But they were also full of contradictions and vague language that could be interpreted multiple ways, perfect for someone like Karen, who wanted to selectively enforce the rules. What I did find, buried in Section 8, was an interesting clause about right of access. It stated that homeowners must have unimpeded access to their properties at all times, and that no vehicle or structure shall block driveways, walkways, or entrances. I took a photo of this section with my phone, saving it for later. 2 days passed without incident. Then, on Saturday afternoon, I returned from grocery shopping to find Karen's BMW once again blocking my driveway. This time, there was no HOA meeting that I knew of. I spotted her across the street, chatting with another board member on their front lawn. When she saw me pull up, she actually waved, as if nothing were amiss. I approached them, grocery bags in hand. "Excuse me, Karen, but you're blocking my driveway again." She turned to me with a look of mild surprise. "Oh, am I? I'm just dropping off some updated bylaws to the Thompsons. It'll only take a few minutes." "There's plenty of space to park without blocking access to my home," I said, trying to keep my voice level. The other board member, a thin man named Richard who always voted with Karen, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should move the car, Karen." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'll be done shortly. 5 minutes won't kill anyone." She turned back to Richard, effectively dismissing me. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of her car blocking my driveway. At the sound of the camera click, Karen whirled around. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Documenting a violation of Section 8 of the HOA bylaws," I replied calmly. "The one about unimpeded access to properties." Karen's face flushed. "You can't take pictures of my car without permission." "Actually, I can. This is a public street, and you're violating a rule that affects my property." I held up my phone. "I'm going to start documenting every time this happens." "Are you threatening me?" Her voice rose sharply. "Not at all. Just exercising my rights as a homeowner in this community." I smiled, turned, and walked away. It was a small victory, but I knew I had only escalated things. Sure enough, 3 days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA citing 4 violations on my property: my hydrangeas, too tall, a barely visible oil stain on my driveway, environmental hazard, the color of my garden hose, not an approved shade of green, and, most absurdly, excessive bird activity at my bird feeder, creating noise pollution. The violations letter was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried reasoning with Karen through official channels. I sent a polite email to the entire HOA board, citing the relevant bylaw sections about driveway access and requesting a formal discussion at the next meeting. The response came not from the board secretary as protocol dictated, but from Karen herself. Your concerns have been noted. However, temporary parking for official HOA business takes precedence. We suggest you plan your comings and goings around scheduled HOA activities. I stared at the email in disbelief. Plan my life around when Karen might randomly decide to block my driveway? This couldn't possibly be legal. I decided to take a different approach. At the next HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse, I arrived early and introduced myself to other homeowners. Most were polite but distant, their eyes darting nervously toward the door, as if afraid Karen might catch them fraternizing with the enemy. A few, however, seemed genuinely sympathetic. "She's been like this for years," whispered Eleanor, an older woman who lived at the end of the street. "My grandson came to visit last summer with his service dog, and she sent me a violation notice claiming pets over 30 pounds weren't allowed, even though service animals are explicitly exempt in the bylaws. She cited me for excessive holiday spirit when I put up 2 strings of lights instead of 1 last Christmas," added Michael, a middle-aged teacher who lived across from the community pool. "Said it was creating light pollution." When Karen arrived, the room fell silent. She conducted the meeting with ruthless efficiency, glossing over old business and moving quickly to new violations. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, I raised my hand. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, but she had no choice but to acknowledge me. "I'd like to discuss the issue of vehicles blocking private driveways," I began, keeping my voice steady. "I've experienced this problem multiple times, and I believe it violates Section 8 of our bylaws." Before I could continue, Karen interrupted. "If you're referring to official HOA business, there's a clause in Section 15 that permits temporary access restrictions during administrative activities." She smiled thinly. "Perhaps you haven't read the complete bylaws." "I have, actually," I replied, pulling out my copy. "Section 15 refers to planned community events with proper notice, not impromptu meetings or social visits." A few homeowners nodded in agreement, but Karen was already moving on. "We'll take that under advisement. Next item." After the meeting, Michael approached me in the parking lot. "That took guts," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "But be careful. The last guy who challenged Karen ended up with so many violation notices he eventually sold his house and moved." "She can't be that powerful," I protested. Michael laughed humorlessly. "Her brother-in-law is on the city council, and her best friend works for the county permit office. Trust me, she's got connections." I drove home feeling both encouraged and disheartened. I wasn't alone in my frustration with Karen, but the other homeowners were too intimidated to stand up to her, and with her connections, fighting through official channels might be more difficult than I'd anticipated. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a car door slamming. I peered through my bedroom window to see Karen's BMW parked across my driveway yet again. This time, she wasn't even pretending to be on official business. She was jogging up to the Wilsons' front door with what looked like a fruit basket. I grabbed my phone and recorded video of the car blocking my driveway, capturing the timestamp and a clear view of Karen entering the Wilsons' house. Then I did something I should have done from the beginning. I called the non-emergency police line. "Sir, this is really a civil matter," the dispatcher told me after I explained the situation. "If it's a homeowners association dispute, you should handle it through those channels." "It's not just an HOA issue," I insisted. "Someone is repeatedly blocking access to my property. If I called about a random stranger doing this, you'd send someone out." The dispatcher sighed. "We'll send an officer when one becomes available, but it might be a while." Nearly 2 hours later, a patrol car finally pulled up. By then, Karen had returned to her vehicle and was about to drive away. When she saw the police car, her expression was priceless, a mixture of shock and indignation. The officer, a young woman named Rodriguez, according to her nameplate, approached both of us. "What seems to be the problem here?" Before I could speak, Karen launched into her defense. "Officer, this is a simple misunderstanding. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association and I was conducting official business. This gentleman is new to the community and doesn't understand how things work here." Officer Rodriguez turned to me with a questioning look. "This is the 5th time she's blocked my driveway in the past month," I explained, showing her the photos and videos I'd collected on my phone. "I've asked her repeatedly not to do it, and I've tried addressing it through HOA channels, but she refuses to stop." The officer reviewed my evidence, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, regardless of your position, you can't block someone's driveway without their permission. It's a violation of City Ordinance 23.7. Karen's face flushed. "This is absurd. The HOA has jurisdiction over parking matters within the community. HOA rules don't supersede city law," Officer Rodriguez replied calmly. "I'm not going to issue a citation this time, but consider this an official warning. If it happens again, there will be consequences." Karen glared at me as if I'd betrayed some unspoken community code. Without another word, she got into her BMW and drove away. Officer Rodriguez turned to me. "You might want to document any future incidents. If she continues, we can issue a citation or even have the vehicle towed." "Thank you," I said, relieved that someone had finally taken me seriously. "No problem. Though between you and me," she added in a lower voice, "we get a lot of calls from this neighborhood. Your HOA president has quite a reputation at the station." After the officer left, I felt a momentary surge of triumph. Surely Karen wouldn't risk a police citation just to inconvenience me. But my victory was short-lived. That evening, I received an email notification of an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for the following night. The agenda listed only one item: discussion of recent security concerns and potential amendments to community safety protocols. I didn't need a translator to understand what that meant. Karen was planning her counterattack. The emergency meeting was held at Karen's house, a colonial-style home with perfectly manicured topiary and not a blade of grass out of place. About 20 homeowners attended, most looking confused about the urgency. Karen stood at the front of her living room, flanked by the other board members. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice grave. "It has come to our attention that there have been disturbing events in our community that threaten the peaceful environment we've worked so hard to maintain." Her eyes found mine in the crowd. "One of our newer residents has taken it upon himself to involve city authorities in what should have been a simple internal matter. This escalation has raised serious concerns about our community governance structure." Several homeowners turned to look at me. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart was pounding. "Therefore," Karen continued, "the board proposes an amendment to our bylaws. The new rule would require all homeowners to seek HOA approval before contacting any external authorities regarding community matters. Failure to do so would result in significant fines." A murmur ran through the room. Even by Karen's standards, this was overreach. "Is that even legal?" someone asked from the back. "Our legal counsel has assured us it falls within our authority," Karen replied smoothly, though I noticed she didn't actually have any lawyer present. "Now, shall we put it to a vote?" I raised my hand. "Point of order. According to HOA regulations, bylaw amendments require a minimum 2-week notice period for homeowners to review before voting." Karen's smile tightened. "This is an emergency safety measure which has different requirements." "There's no emergency," I countered, standing up. "This is clearly retaliatory action because I reported a legitimate parking violation to the police after multiple attempts to resolve it through HOA channels failed." The room grew tense. I could see some homeowners nodding in agreement while others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation. Furthermore, I continued, restricting homeowners' rights to contact law enforcement isn't just questionable from an HOA standpoint, it potentially violates state law. One of the other board members, a lawyer named David, shifted uncomfortably. He might have a point, Karen. We should probably consult with our attorney before proceeding. Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but she quickly composed herself. Very well. We'll postpone the vote pending legal review. In the meantime, I hope all residents will remember that we're a community that handles our affairs internally whenever possible. The meeting adjourned without a vote, but the battle lines had been drawn. As people filed out, several homeowners gave me approving nods or whispered words of support. Others avoided eye contact entirely, clearly not wanting to be seen taking sides against Karen. I should have expected what happened next, but it still caught me off guard. The following morning, I opened my front door to find not one but 3 separate HOA violation notices taped to it. The first cited excessive noise from my home office. I had been on a conference call the previous afternoon. The second claimed my garage door had been left open for more than the allowed 30 minutes. It hadn't. The third was the most creative. Apparently, the bird feeder in my backyard was attracting non-natural species and needed to be removed immediately. Each violation carried a $100 fine, due within 7 days. I photographed the notices, then carefully removed them from my door. As I did so, I noticed Karen watching from across the street, a smug smile on her face. She raised her coffee mug in a mock toast before turning and walking back into her house. This was war. Over the next 3 weeks, the situation escalated further. Karen's BMW appeared across my driveway with clockwork regularity. Always for less than an hour, always when she knew I'd be coming home from work. Each time, I documented it with photos and videos. I called the police twice more, but by the time they arrived, she had always moved her car. The violation notices continued as well. Sometimes for legitimate minor infractions, but more often for invented or exaggerated offenses. I appealed each one through the proper channels, which meant my evenings were increasingly consumed with drafting responses and gathering evidence. You need to fight fire with fire, suggested Michael, who had become something of an ally. We were standing in his driveway on a Saturday morning, ostensibly discussing lawn care products while actually strategizing. Find some violation on her property and report her. I've looked, I admitted. Her place is immaculate. She follows every rule to the letter, except the one about blocking driveways, apparently. There's got to be something you can do, Michael insisted. People are watching this situation, you know. If she gets away with targeting you like this, we're all vulnerable. He was right. This had become bigger than just my personal vendetta against Karen. It was about standing up to a bully who had the entire community under her thumb. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Michael's words, about the fearful faces of my neighbors, about Karen's smug expression as she watched me remove those violation notices from my door. There had to be a solution. Something legal but effective, something that would put an end to her harassment once and for all. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and went to my home office. I began researching property laws, city ordinances, and HOA regulations. I read case studies of homeowners who had successfully challenged overbearing associations. I dug through forum posts from people who had dealt with similar situations. And then I found it, a legal precedent that might just be my salvation. In a case from 2018, a homeowner in a nearby county had successfully argued that repeated blocking of their driveway constituted a private nuisance under common law. More importantly, the court had affirmed the homeowner's right to install a protective barrier to prevent such nuisances, provided it was on their own property and didn't violate city building codes. I began sketching plans, calculating costs, researching suppliers. By the time the sun rose, I had a detailed proposal and a renewed sense of purpose. Karen might control the HOA, but I controlled my property line, and I was about to exercise that control in a way she'd never expect. First, I needed expert confirmation that my plan was legally sound. I scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney named Jennifer Lee, who specialized in homeowner disputes. Her office was small but immaculate, with framed law degrees and bar admissions covering one wall. "Let me get this straight," she said after I explained my situation. "The HOA president regularly blocks your driveway, has issued multiple questionable violations against you, and attempted to pass a rule preventing homeowners from contacting authorities?" "That's correct," I replied, showing her my documentation. "I've tried resolving it through HOA channels, through direct communication, and by involving the police. Nothing has stopped her." Jennifer reviewed my evidence carefully, occasionally making notes. "This is textbook harassment," she confirmed, "and your proposed solution is legally viable, though I would recommend a few modifications." She outlined the changes, primarily related to permits and specific installation requirements, to ensure compliance with city codes. "The key," she emphasized, "is that it must be entirely on your property, not encroaching on the HOA common areas or the public street." "I've already verified the property lines," I assured her. "The driveway and 3 feet on either side belong to me." "Perfect. And you're planning to handle this yourself?" she asked, eyeing me with new respect. "I've got the technical skills," I confirmed. "Home automation is kind of my hobby." Jennifer smiled. "Well then, let's make this official." She drafted a notification letter to the HOA board informing them of my intention to install security measures on my property in response to ongoing access issues. The letter was deliberately vague about the specifics, but meticulously cited relevant laws and precedents. "Send this by certified mail," she instructed. "That establishes an official record, and before you begin installation, make sure you have all the necessary permits from the city." I thanked her and paid her fee, feeling it was the best money I'd ever spent. On my way out, she called after me, "Mr. Mitchell, I'd love to hear how this turns out." The next 2 weeks were a flurry of activity. I submitted applications for the necessary permits, ordered materials, and continued documenting Karen's harassment. She seemed to sense something was coming. Her violations became even more frequent and absurd. One notice claimed my mailbox was 2 inches higher than regulation height, even though it was the standard model installed by the developer. Finally, my permits were approved and my supplies arrived. I took a week off work, ostensibly for a home improvement project. Karen watched suspiciously from her front yard as delivery trucks dropped off materials. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out what I was planning and how she could stop it. On Monday morning, I began construction. The plans were simple but elegant: a remote-controlled gate that would span my driveway, preventing anyone from blocking access. The gate would be tasteful, matching the aesthetic of the neighborhood, but unmistakably effective. I had barely started digging the first post hole when Karen marched across the street. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, arms crossed over her chest. I smiled pleasantly. "Installing a security gate on my property. Don't worry, I have all the necessary permits." I handed her copies, which I'd prepared specifically for this moment. Karen snatched the papers, her eyes scanning rapidly. "This isn't in compliance with HOA architectural guidelines," she insisted. "All exterior modifications require board approval." "Actually," I replied calmly, "the HOA covenant explicitly states that security measures required due to ongoing nuisance or safety concerns are exempt from the standard approval process. It's in Section 17, Paragraph 4.I. I'd be happy to show you." Karen's face flushed. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. "Besides," I continued, "I've already notified the board of my intentions. The certified letter was delivered last week." I returned to my digging, acting as if the conversation was over. "This isn't the end of this," Karen hissed before storming back to her house. I knew it wasn't, but for the first time since moving to Whispering Pines, I felt like I had the upper hand. Over the next 3 days, I worked steadily on the gate installation. Other homeowners walked by, some openly curious, others pretending not to notice. A few, including Michael and Eleanor, stopped to chat and offer encouragement. Word was spreading through the neighborhood about my stand against Karen. On Wednesday afternoon, a city inspector arrived, much sooner than scheduled. I recognized Karen's hand in this. She'd probably called in a favor to try to find some code violation. Someone reported possible unpermitted construction, the inspector explained, looking slightly embarrassed. I smiled and produced my permits along with detailed plans showing that everything was within code requirements and on my property. The inspector reviewed them carefully, then performed his inspection. "Everything looks in order," he confirmed, signing off on the permit card. "Nice work, actually. Clean installation." As he was leaving, I noticed Karen watching from her car parked down the street. When she saw the inspector shake my hand, her expression darkened. She pulled away abruptly, tires squealing slightly. By Friday, the gate was complete. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, wrought iron with decorative elements that complemented the neighborhood aesthetic. It operated smoothly on a motorized track controlled by a remote I kept in my car and a keypad mounted discreetly on a post. The entire setup was powered by a small solar panel on my roof with a battery backup. But the true genius, the element that would deliver justice, was hidden in plain sight. Next to the keypad was a small payment terminal with a sign that read, "Private access fee, $50 per entry. Proceeds donated to the City Beautification Fund." I had no intention of actually charging anyone to use my driveway. The terminal wasn't even fully functional, but it sent a clear message. Access to my property was under my control, and there would be consequences for those who had abused it in the past. The final touch was a high-definition security camera mounted above the gate, recording continuously and backing up to cloud storage. If Karen tried anything now, I'd have irrefutable evidence. That evening, as I stood admiring my handiwork, Michael walked over. "It's impressive," he said, examining the gate, "but do you really think it will stop her?" "I'm counting on it not stopping her," I replied. "I'm counting on her trying something stupid." I didn't have to wait long. Saturday morning, I was enjoying coffee on my porch when Karen's BMW pulled up in front of my house. She got out, marched up to my gate, and began examining it closely, running her hand along the metalwork as if searching for flaws. I stepped outside. "Good morning, Karen. Can I help you with something?" She turned, her face a mask of barely contained rage. "This monstrosity violates at least 3 HOA guidelines. I'm preparing a formal citation." "Actually, it doesn't violate any guidelines," I replied. "It's a security measure installed in response to documented harassment, which is explicitly permitted under both HOA and city regulations." I gestured to the camera above us. "By the way, this conversation is being recorded." Karen's eyes darted to the camera, then back to me. "You think you're so clever," she hissed. "This isn't over." "You're right about that," I agreed. "It isn't over until you stop blocking my driveway and targeting me with fraudulent violations. Speaking of which, how did the board respond to my appeals?" "I haven't heard anything official yet." "The board is still reviewing your frivolous complaints," she said dismissively. "All 12 of them? With photographic evidence? That's a lot of frivolity." I took a sip of my coffee. "By the way, did you notice the new feature?" I pointed to the payment terminal. "Since my driveway seems to be such popular parking for you, I figured I might as well monetize it." Karen's face went from red to purple. "You can't charge people to park on a public street." "I'm not," I clarified. "The street remains free for anyone to use, but this," I gestured to my driveway, "is private property, and access to it now comes with a fee for those who've abused the privilege in the past." For a moment, I thought Karen might actually explode. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. This is extortion." "Go ahead," I encouraged her. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in why you're so concerned about accessing a driveway you claim you never blocked. I've got plenty of documentation to refresh their memory about our previous interactions." Karen stared at me, her finger hovering over her phone. Then, without another word, she stormed back to her car and drove away, tires screeching. I smiled and returned to my porch. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for Karen to walk into it. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made Whispering Pines look like a real estate brochure come to life. I was enjoying a leisurely breakfast when my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Heads up, emergency HOA meeting called for 2 p.m. today. Karen's on the warpath." I smiled, buttering my toast with deliberate calm. This was exactly what I'd expected. Karen was too predictable. Faced with a challenge to her authority, she always escalated rather than retreated. The meeting would be her attempt to rally the community against me, to make an example of my defiance. But this time I was prepared. At precisely 1:55 p.m. I strolled into the community clubhouse. The room was already packed, with nearly every homeowner in attendance. Word had spread rapidly about my gate and Karen's reaction to it. People were whispering in small groups, falling silent as I entered. I noticed several subtle nods of encouragement as I found a seat near the back. Karen arrived exactly at 2 p.m., flanked by the other board members. Her face was composed, but I could see the tension in her posture, the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her papers at the podium. This wasn't just another HOA meeting for her. It was a battle for control. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice overly bright. "We've called this emergency session to address a serious violation of our community standards that threatens the aesthetic harmony and property values we all work so hard to maintain." She clicked a remote, and a photo of my gate appeared on the projection screen. There were a few murmurs from the audience, but whether of approval or disapproval, I couldn't tell. "As you can see, one of our residents has installed an unauthorized security gate across his driveway," Karen continued, not looking in my direction. "While security is certainly important, this installation violates multiple HOA guidelines regarding architectural modifications, and more concerningly, includes a commercial element in a residential zone." She zoomed in on the payment terminal, eliciting more murmurs. "Therefore, the board proposes immediate action. A formal violation notice, a $500 fine, and an order to remove the installation within 7 days or face additional penalties." She looked up, scanning the room with the confident expression of someone who expected no resistance. "Are there any questions before we vote?" I raised my hand, and Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She had no choice but to acknowledge me. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell?" I stood, addressing not Karen but the entire room. "Before we proceed with a vote, I'd like to clarify a few important points for everyone's consideration." I moved to the front of the room, pulling a thumb drive from my pocket. "May I use the projector for a moment?" Karen hesitated, then nodded stiffly. I plugged in the drive and pulled up my presentation. "First, let me address the legality of my gate installation," I began, displaying my approved permits and property survey. "As you can see, the gate is entirely on my private property, properly permitted by the city and in compliance with all building codes." I clicked to the next slide showing the relevant HOA bylaw. "Second, according to our own covenants, security measures necessitated by documented nuisance or safety concerns are specifically exempt from standard architectural review. I'd like to explain why this exemption applies in my case." What followed was a methodical presentation of evidence, photos, videos, time-stamped records, and police reports documenting Karen's persistent blocking of my driveway, along with the retaliatory violation notices I'd received after attempting to address the issue through proper channels. "This hasn't been a one-time inconvenience," I explained, showing a calendar with each incident marked. "It's been a systematic pattern of harassment that has impeded my rightful access to my property." The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. Several homeowners were shifting in their seats, glancing sideways at Karen, whose face had gone from flushed to ashen. As for the payment terminal, I continued, it's important to clarify that I have no intention of actually charging anyone to use my driveway. It's symbolic, a statement about the value of access that has been repeatedly violated. I paused, looking directly at Karen for the first time. However, if anyone is particularly concerned about it, I'd be happy to consider removing that specific element. I clicked to my final slide, a copy of the certified letter I'd sent to the HOA board, notifying them of my intention to install the gate. As you can see, I followed proper procedures. This letter was delivered last week, providing ample notice before installation began. Karen stood abruptly. That letter was addressed to the board, not to me personally. I never received it. I smiled apologetically. I have the delivery confirmation showing it was signed for by you, Karen. I displayed the receipt with her signature clearly visible. Perhaps it got misplaced in your other paperwork. A homeowner near the front, I recognized him as a retired judge, raised his hand. I'd like to ask the board, was this letter discussed at any recent meeting? The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. David, the lawyer who had expressed concerns at the previous meeting, cleared his throat. I don't recall seeing it. Karen interrupted quickly. We received numerous communications. It must have been overlooked in processing. That seems unfortunate, the retired judge remarked, given that it concerned a matter now deemed serious enough for an emergency meeting. Another homeowner stood up, Janet, who lived next door to Karen. I have a question. If security measures are exempt from review when there's a documented nuisance, and Mr. Mitchell has clearly documented this nuisance, on what grounds is the board proposing to fine him? Karen's composure was cracking. The exemption doesn't apply in this case because the board determines what constitutes a valid security concern, and we've made no such determination. Actually, I interjected gently, the bylaw doesn't specify that the board must pre-approve the determination. It simply states that the security concern must be documented, which I've demonstrated it is. David shifted uncomfortably again. He's correct about the wording, he admitted. The atmosphere in the room had changed. What Karen had planned as a show of force against me had transformed into a public examination of her leadership. I could see homeowners whispering to each other, some openly frowning at Karen. Eleanor, the older woman who had told me about her grandson's service dog, stood up. I move that we table this discussion until the board has had proper time to review all the evidence presented today. I second that motion, called another homeowner. Karen looked as if she'd swallowed something bitter. Very well. All in favor of tabling the discussion? Nearly every hand in the room went up. Motion carried, Karen said tersely. The meeting is adjourned. As people began filing out, many stopped to speak with me. Some shared their own stories of run-ins with Karen. Others simply offered words of support. Karen left quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Michael clapped me on the shoulder. That was masterful, he said. I've never seen her so thoroughly outmaneuvered. I shrugged. I just came prepared. It's more than that, Eleanor said, joining us. You stood up to her when no one else would. You might have just changed everything around here. I hoped she was right, but I suspected the battle wasn't over yet. Karen had been publicly embarrassed, something she wouldn't take lightly. Sure enough, the next morning I discovered that overnight someone had splashed red paint across my new gate. The security camera had captured the entire incident. Karen, dressed in dark clothing, approaching at 2 a.m. with a can of paint. The footage was crystal clear, showing her face in perfect detail as she vandalized my property. I called the police immediately, and this time, when Officer Rodriguez arrived, I had irrefutable evidence to share. This goes beyond an HOA dispute, she noted as she reviewed the footage. This is criminal vandalism. Karen was arrested that afternoon. The charge was misdemeanor vandalism, but the real damage was to her reputation. News spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by evening her perfectly manicured lawn was marred by something new, a "for sale" sign. 3 days later, I received an official communication from the HOA board. David had been appointed interim president, and the board had unanimously voted to dismiss all pending violations against me. Furthermore, they were initiating a comprehensive review of all HOA rules and enforcement procedures to ensure fair and transparent governance. The payment terminal disappeared from my gate. I removed it myself as it had served its purpose. But the gate remained, a symbol of boundaries respected and justice served. Karen's house sold quickly at a price well below market value. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to a condominium in the next town over, one without an HOA. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As summer turned to fall, Whispering Pines underwent a transformation. Under David's leadership, the HOA became more transparent and less punitive. Rules were simplified, communication improved, and a new spirit of community began to emerge. The annual block party, which had been a stiff, formal affair under Karen's regime, became a genuinely enjoyable celebration. My gate became something of a local legend. New residents would hear the story from old-timers, often embellished with details that made it sound like a modern David and Goliath tale. I didn't mind the exaggerations. They served as a reminder that standing up to bullies, even when it seems impossible, is sometimes the only way to effect change. One crisp October evening, almost 6 months after the gate incident as it had come to be known, I was raking leaves in my front yard when a car slowed in front of my house. It was Officer Rodriguez, off duty in her personal vehicle. "Just thought you'd like to know," she said, leaning out her window. "Karen tried to join the HOA board in her new community last month. Apparently, someone shared our police report with the selection committee. Her application was unanimously rejected." I laughed. Karma has a way of catching up. "That it does," she agreed. "By the way, nice gate. Much less dramatic without the payment terminal, though." "Some props are only needed for the first act," I replied with a smile. After she drove away, I stood looking at my gate. Simple, functional, and a daily reminder that boundaries matter. In the months since its installation, not a single car had blocked my driveway. The gate itself was rarely closed these days. It didn't need to be. Its very existence was enough. A week later, the HOA held its quarterly meeting in the clubhouse. The agenda included the election of new board members, and to my surprise, several neighbors had nominated me. "You'd be perfect," Michael insisted when I expressed hesitation. "You understand the rules, but also know when they need to be challenged." That's exactly the perspective this community needs. In the end, I accepted the nomination and was elected with overwhelming support. My first proposal as a board member was to establish what I called the Good Neighbor Guidelines, a simplified version of the HOA rules that emphasized courtesy, communication, and common sense over rigid enforcement. The purpose of an HOA should be to enhance our community, not to control it, I explained at my first meeting as a board member. Rules are necessary, but they should serve the residents, not the other way around. The proposal passed unanimously. Eleanor approached me after the meeting. "You know," she said, her eyes twinkling, "when you first moved in, I gave you 6 months before Karen drove you out. Many others have tried to stand up to her over the years, but they all eventually gave up." "What made me different?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "You fought smart, not angry, and you didn't just fight for yourself. Whether you realized it or not, you were fighting for all of us." I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. What had begun as a personal battle against one overbearing HOA president had evolved into something more meaningful, a reclaiming of community. As I drove home that evening, I noticed a new family moving into Karen's old house. They had children, something Karen would have surely found numerous violations to cite. I made a mental note to stop by the next day to welcome them, to let them know they were moving into a very different Whispering Pines than the one I had found when I arrived. Pulling into my driveway, I paused to appreciate my gate, now adorned with climbing roses rather than a payment terminal. It stood as a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to change a broken system isn't to abandon it, but to transform it from within. Have you ever found yourself facing a seemingly immovable force of petty tyranny? Someone who uses rules as weapons rather than tools? I'd love to hear how you handled it. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that speaking up matters. Setting boundaries matters. And sometimes installing a gate, literal or metaphorical, is exactly what's needed to restore balance and respect. After all, good fences make good neighbors, especially when they come with a powerful lesson about the limits of power itself.